What if I told you that every dollar you spend is controlled by invisible hands that you'll never see? What if the financial system, the one we all rely on every day, isn't what it seems? What if these hidden forces have been manipulating the flow of money for centuries, controlling how wealth is created, and most importantly, who gets to keep it? The question isn't just about who owns the money. The real question is, who owns the system behind it all? Stay with me, because this story is far more sinister and more complicated than you could ever imagine. You've probably never heard of the people who pull the strings of the global financial system, but by the end of this video, you'll wish you had. Title sequence: The Invisible Hands Behind Every Dollar You Spend. Act 1. Origins: The Birth of Money and Debt. Let's rewind the clock, all the way to the beginning of human civilization, before money existed in the way we know it today. Trade was simple. You wanted food, I had food, and we exchanged goods. But as society became more complex, so did our systems of trade. In ancient times, empires would issue coin symbols of power and wealth, made of precious metals like gold and silver. These coins had intrinsic value because they were made from something valuable. You could hold them in your hand and feel the wealth. But what happens when you run out of gold to mint coins? What happens when you can't simply print more wealth? The answer is simple: you borrow. Ancient Babylonians, the Egyptians, and later the Greeks created what we now know as debtor, promised to pay back money or goods at a future time. These early forms of debt were the seeds of what would eventually become the modern financial system. Act 2. The Rise: How Banks Became the Hidden Giants. Fast forward to the Middle Ages. In Italy, a powerful family of bankers, the Medici, began to experiment with an idea that would change the world. They didn't just loan out money, they figured out how to create it. They did this through a concept called fractional reserve banking. This is where the modern financial system begins to take shape. Banks could now lend out money that they didn't actually have. They only needed to keep a small portion of the money in reserve while lending out the rest at interest. This allowed them to create more money on paper than was actually circulating in the economy. But fractional banking did something even more important. It centralized control of wealth. The banks and, later, central banks began to hold the power to decide who could borrow money, who could be trusted, and who would be left out. This was the birth of the invisible hands. Act 3. Breaking point: The Fed and the Creation of a Debt-Driven Economy. As time passed, debt began to grow faster than the economy could support. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that things took a drastic turn. In 1913, a monumental event occurred: the creation of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. On the surface, the Federal Reserve was designed to stabilize the economy, but behind closed doors, it gave unprecedented power to a small group of bankers and elites who now had the authority to control the money supply. Instead of money being backed by gold as it had been for centuries, it was now backed by nothing. Just promises and paper. This change meant one thing: banks could lend more and more money into existence. In fact, the Fed became the primary institution that controlled the flow of money in the US economy and, by extension, the global economy. By 1971, President Nixon took the US off the gold standard entirely, completing the shift to a fiat currency. From this moment on, money would be worth only what the government and central banks said it was worth. The value of the dollar was no longer tied to anything tangible. The system of debt had become the system itself. Act 4, Fallout. The debt crisis and economic collapses. It didn't take long for the cracks to begin showing. The hidden mechanisms that allowed central banks to create money from nothing started to grow out of control. Debt exploded across the globe. Countries, corporations, and individuals were all borrowing more than they could ever repay. And with this explosion in debt came the inevitable financial crises. In 2008, the world experienced one of the largest economic collapses in history. It was a collapse driven by debt, fueled by speculative lending, and manipulated by major financial institutions that knew they could get away with it. The global economy teetered on the edge of total destruction. But instead of fixing the root cause of the problem, the invisible hands behind the debt-driven system governments around the world doubled down. They bailed out the banks, printed more money, and saddled future generations with even more debt. This is the cycle we've been caught in ever since. Act 5, Failed fixes the system's resilience and its hidden costs since the 2008 crisis. There have been many attempts to fix the system. We've had regulatory reforms, debt forgiveness programs, and monetary policies like low interest rates and quantitative easing. But these measures have been like putting a band-aid on a wound that needs stitches. They temporarily stabilize the economy, but they don't address the root issue. The truth is, the system is rigged. The banks and central banks control the flow of money. Every time they print more money or lower interest rates, they're creating more debt, and you, the average person, are left paying for it. Modern parallels, shocking data, and repeating patterns. If you think this is all just history, think again. Today, global debt has reached unprecedented levels. As of 2023, global debt exceeds $300 trillion more than 3 times the global GDP. Central banks like the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan continue to print more money in a desperate attempt to prop up economies. But what happens when these debts can't be repaid? What happens when countries default or when inflation spirals out of control? You don't have to look far for the answers. Just look at Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Argentina. All of them experienced hyperinflation and economic collapse because their governments printed money they couldn't tee back up. The takeaways: what you need to know: money is not what you think it is. It's not tied to gold or anything real anymore. It's just a system of debt created and controlled by central banks. Debt is the backbone of the system. The entire global economy is built on borrowing, lending, and creating more debt. Those who control this system, central banks, banks and financial elites control the economy. The system is rigged. No matter how much debt the government or central banks create, it's the people who end up paying the price. Inflation, job losses, and economic instability are all consequences of this debt-driven economy. Final thought: the hidden costs of financial systems. We reliving in a world where the flow of money is controlled by an invisible network of banks, financial institutions, and governments. They dictate the terms of your financial life, and you probably don't even realize it. But now that you know, the question is, what are you going to do about it? Call to action. If you want to learn more about the hidden financial systems that control your life and what you can do to protect yourself, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this video with your friends because this is information everyone should know.